Okay, we're with Wes Doi, assistant coach. Wes, first of all, I want you to, one of the biggest dynamics of this entire project is talking about the Penn way. When Coach Giesman and Dr. Dean Spiker got together, they've kind of established this mantra, mindset, call it culture system, you call it. I want you to, first of all, what does the Penn way mean to you? And can you talk about how it kind of grew over the years?
Well, having worked with Penn football for 2 years before Chris came, there definitely was a major change when Chris Giesman came to town, and obviously Dr. Spiker was the main force behind that because he just told Chris he wanted to have a winning program, and Chris thought he could do that at Penn. He said it had good enrollment and schedule seemed something they could manage. And so he brought in a little bit of a different philosophy, and the philosophy that I remember most was he brought in the idea of pride, and it became Penn Pride, and then it became Penn Pride statewide when we started going down to the state a number of times. And I think what that brought into the minds of our football players was it's not just a matter of putting on a Penn uniform, and obviously for the years before Chris came, there were a lot of good athletes and good kids, but they just weren't quite as successful as after Coach Giesman got to Penn. And I think it was him instilling, he and his staff instilling the fact that when you do things on the football field, you're not doing it for your coach, you're not doing it for your, for anything other than making Penn a better football team and making themselves better individuals. And I can remember as a freshman coach, I started a freshman t-shirt program where each year we would give a kid a t-shirt about Penn freshman football, but always on the back it said it's a matter of pride. So when we talked about doing things, the reason was because it's for your own pride and that you wanted to be better than maybe you were the day before. So I would say Chris brought in the fact that kids need to try to be better just because of their own pride.
Let's address Chris coming in, those first couple meetings, sitting down with the coaches, kind of shuffling things around. Obviously you knew things were going to change dramatically. A lot of pressure on Chris. Because Dr. Spiker said, you're going to win or I'm going to fire you. So let's just talk about some of those those first couple staff meetings and just kind of maybe your interview into the whole thing.
Well, I do have to say when Chris Giesman came to Penn and met with the staff, it was very obvious that he was very confident in his ability to coach football and his knowledge of football. And over the 40 years that I've known him, he has been, he's lived up to everyone's, estimations of his talent and knowledge. I'd go to clinics with him and I was amazed that college coaches would come to him and maybe ask for tips about how to run the veer offense or how do you run this boot pass or how do you do this. And it always amazed me that here was this high school coach that coaches all over the nation would call him, and Chris was smart enough. He also went to other coaches. I can remember him going down to Houston with Coach Yeoman and learning more about how to run the veer offense. And he'd spend time at other schools where he would just go with a specific purpose, not just to go look at the program, but specific purpose and questions that he had about running the veer offense. And to me, that was the first thing that caught my eye, is that he was so meticulous about details. Every little thing. As a matter of fact, Chris and I were together last week, and that's one of the things we talked about, having specific details for every play, for every position, for every pass cut, for every quarterback steps, for every quarterback fake. And he believed it, and he instilled in all of us as assistants that when we're coaching, we teach the players why a play will work, what will happen if you don't run a play, let's say, exactly on the running track. And so I think his attention to detail was a major fact. And then I can remember the first time sitting in a film session with Coach Giesman, and at that time I had probably only been coaching about 4 or 5 years, so I'm sitting in the film session and someone asked the question, well, what the heck happened? That play looked so good. And Chris knew what all 11 players did, which players messed up, which players did a good job, why this play didn't work. And I was just in awe of that. And I think, that helped me understand the importance of looking into the small details of everything we did on the field. And as a matter of fact, everything we did at practice. I mean, he was very detail oriented. He always, if somebody did something incorrectly, he'd correct it immediately. And it wasn't, hey, you got to do a better job. He said, well, you need to step right at 3 o'clock and you need to make sure you're staying on track and you have to have a certain mesh point. And so I do think that was one of the differences between, I worked under Roger Reynolds for a little bit, and it wasn't that Roger wasn't knowledgeable, but I just don't, having the ability to coach that knowledge into the players, I think made a huge difference.
Chris gave a lot of leeway, a lot of responsibility to his assistant coaches. You were basically a head coach of the position that you're in. So let's visit that.
Yeah, the years I worked with Chris at the varsity level, I learned that lesson right away. One of my responsibilities was the kickoff team. And we had a pretty successful kickoff team, but then I can remember a game where a opponent ran the ball back past the 50. And at the time, most of the time I worked with Chris, I was in the box and helping to call offensive plays, and I can remember him turning around and looking at me up in the box saying, what the hell was that? And this is not over a mic or a headset, he just yelled it out. So you're right, he definitely gave us all the freedom that we needed. If anybody also would question anything, if you're doing something different, like I can remember on that kickoff team, I looped the 2 outside men to the inside, which for blocking purposes of the opponent, it made it a little more difficult to know who they were going to block. And Chris, sat down with me and just made sure I was doing it for the right reasons and that I thought it would work, and he never questioned it. The formation of kickoff all that time. The rest of the time, I was pretty much an assistant and worked with Chris and Trent Yeoman and Dave Geyer in the backfield. And so that was actually more of a learning time for me, because that's where I started to understand how important Chris's attention to detail was in coaching football.
You had the great fortune of sitting down with Chris and penning his memoirs, if you will, in the Giesman game. So let's talk about going back. And the thing that I've noticed in sitting down with our film sessions with Chris, his memory, he is still sharp as a tack. His attention to detail right now is still off the chart. So talk about sitting down with this labor of love, which was the Giesman game.
Well, it wasn't exactly that we sat down. Chris and I like to every once in a while take a trip to the west and to a couple of the casinos. So, on that hour and a half trip, when I first started thinking about writing the book, Chris and I just reminisce about all the good players that we had, all the great teams that we had. And I can remember talking to him about, what's the difference between a team that wins the state and a team that gets to state, as opposed to a team that doesn't get there? And Chris always said, first of all, a little bit of luck. He said every time we won a state championship, there was definitely some luck involved. And the other thing was, and as a matter of fact, Chris and I talked about this last week, that what makes the difference, it's hard to put your finger on. And so when Corey's had great success and been to the state a few times, but in the state has not had a lot of success. And so that's what he's still building, and he's got a great staff, and I'm sure they're gonna reach that point, but it is something that Chris Giesman brought. So this whole book, the Giesman game idea, came about because he and I were just reminisce stories, and like you said, his memory is so good. He knew details, he knew players, and obviously being a part of it, it made it very enjoyable for me to relive those memories. And so we kept driving back and forth, and pretty soon I started bringing my little tape recorder with me. And I told him, I said, I'm thinking about writing a book. You don't mind if I tape? Obviously he didn't. And so I doubt that we ever just sat down and said, you remember what happened here? I mean, it was just riding back and forth. And then obviously there were times that we might be doing something else, but it would almost always come out. When we'd go to the state clinic, one of the stories in the book talks about the coaches sitting around in the hotel room after the clinic. This is like 2 in the morning, and someone brought up the idea, well, who was your best player at each position? And we probably spent hours bringing up all the good players at every position, and I don't think we could. We decided you can't pick who's the best, like, quarterback, and we had some unbelievable quarterbacks. And I think it came about that even though when we played games, most people said the other team, like especially at the state games, the other team was much more talented. And I sort of have to agree with that, but that night, when you talked about all the great players Chris had, you could argue against that. So we had some great players. So at any rate, then on the way back from the state clinic, we talked about a little bit more. It's kind of confirmed that I was going to write this book. And again, we had no idea how long it would take, and it probably took us over 7 years to finish the whole book. And when Chris retired, I was always a little leery about, is he going to be all right? And he's been very good about working out daily, and his wife Jane watches what he's eating, and he has really improved his eating habits. So he's probably twice as healthy as when he retired right now. But I was a little anxious because I wasn't, sure what was going to happen. The Giesman men, Chris has outlived the age of any Giesman male, and so at the end I kind of rushed it through just to make sure we'd get it done. And when I got it done, found some local publishers, thanks to a local sportscaster, gave me the name of this Corby Publishers, and they liked the book and they published it right away. And the only regret I have now is that because I rushed it a little bit, I don't think we caught all the mistakes we should have, which someone told me you're never going to catch them all. So,
exactly.
And then we were lucky enough, we sold out our first printing of 1,000 books, and had another 500 printed, and we're almost sold out of those. So I don't know if there will be a third edition, but at any rate, it was a great job, and I've always thought that the idea of writing about memories is fun to do, but it's still work, and that's the way the book was. I mean, it was fun to relive all of those years and all of those games, but it was it was a lot of work, and so I appreciated Chris. Anytime I had a question or he had a suggestion, he'd give it to me, and I thought we worked well together. And I've always felt that about Chris. Even though I was a freshman coach most of my career, he always listened to any idea that I had. If I had a suggestion for offense, I mean, he put in a couple plays that I liked. He, we used to always snap the ball on an extra point, down 88, go, and we'd snap it just like we did every other play. And I had decided, well, I'm not going on go because the opponents were so set on jumping on go that a lot of times we'd have people jump off sides. And to this day, I think Corey still uses that. Don't go on go, you go on the ball. And I know that Corey's had some chances to go for 2 just because of that penalty. But Chris was always open to suggestions. But he would make you, if you had questions about your suggestion, he'd ask him. I think that's one of the best parts of our friendship. I think we're very honest with each other and upfront, and that's definitely helped me as an individual and as a coach. And every sport I've ever coached, Chris has had an influence on my practice schedules and how things are taught.
Let's talk about the transition from Coach Giesman to Coach Corey Yeoman and some of the transitional. Corey stepped in and the guys didn't miss a beat. They make a magical run the first year out. So kind of just talk about working with Corey, being involved in Corey, and watching this youngster who you watch basically grow up, become a tremendous coach in his own right.
Yeah, obviously Chris had Corey in mind probably the last 5 or 6 or maybe even 10 years that he coached. Corey had played with us and gone through the whole system, and he always said when he came in, this is Chris Giesman's program, I'm just carrying it on. And obviously he's done a tremendous job. And like most younger coaches, he had things to learn. He had things to learn just becoming a head coach as opposed to being the defensive coordinator. And then he had a very young staff. And even though most of the staff members were past Penn players, there were still a lot of things that had to be worked out. And so that when the younger players like Trent Yeoman became the offensive coordinator, and those things all needed to be worked out, how the offense would work together and how the coaching staff of the defense would work together. And right now I think Corey has an outstanding staff. And Dean Spiker and Chris Giesman both have always said the key to success is not trying to do everything yourself. The key to success is to find people that can do the job and then let them do the job. And so both of those men, I think, promoted the idea of you need a good staff to do that. And I think Corey's staff is very good right now.
Your favorite Penn moment? Pick a couple of them out.
Well, I had a son and a daughter who went through Penn. My daughter was a cheerleader, my son was a football player. So one of my favorite moments is after we beat Ben Davis in '96. My daughter was on the field as a cheerleader, my son was on the field as a player, and so I got that picture of the Ben Davis score that we came back to beat Ben Davis, and then my 2 children with me. I mean, that's definitely a highlight. Obviously, every one of the state championships is very special, and Chris and I were talking about that last week too, that you think about the games that we won and lost in the state, and almost every one of the games that we won, or all of the games that we won, someone on the team stepped up and said, we're not losing this game. Matt Giesman did it in '95, Nick Bayline did it in '96, Kevin Nicklini did it in '97. Eric Moore was a great leader, and fortunately they were good enough, I don't think they had to step up. They just played their game and beat a very good Center Grove team. '83, the same thing happened. Chris, in the book it talks about Chris is in the locker room throwing up, and the whole time the offensive line coaches are saying, Coach, we got it. And so I do think that and part of that's just Chris, getting the players to believe in themselves. And like he said, you can have good players, but you can't teach them to win state championships. Someone has to step up and do the job. And so all the state championships are highlight games, but all kinds of games that I could talk about that are good memories.
Final thought, Chris said that every single day he went to work, they laughed and had a good time. So can you share some of those? A funny story that jumps off the page at you?
Well, I mean, there are tons of stories like that, but we had a lot of very good coaches on the staff, and I can remember one of my favorite people, Wally Yeoman, and that's Corey's dad, was the defensive backfield coach, and Wally had kind of a colorful way to give direction sometimes. And one of the neighbors back by Creek Field had complained that, you know, coaches are using kind of bad language, you need to cut that down. So I don't remember if it was Dean, but I think it was Dean, called Chris and said, you need to curb your coach's language out here. And so Chris had a pre-practice meeting and told us all, he said, you know, we need to tone it down. You can still make a point, you just don't have to cuss a lot about it. And so, you know, Chuck Wagner was there, and all the coaches are like, well, you know, you're right, we'll control that. And then something happened, and Wally got kind of fired up, and the neighbor came over and was telling Coach Yum, he said, you know, I told your head coach, you guys need to quit this cussing on the football field. And naturally, Wally burst out in a number of colorful words to let that neighbor know that the way we do things at Penn Football is Penn Football. And I do think over the years we definitely toned things down, but I always think of that. And as a matter of fact, every time we have a home game, I think that neighbor's still mad at us, because most of the time, if it's leaf burning season, you'll see smoke coming out of Freed Field, and that neighbor's still kind of upset about that. So that was kind of a classic Wally Yeoman story.